Recording in progress.
Welcome to the City Council special meeting this Tuesday evening on September 5th. I now call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
With pleasure, Mayor. Councilmember Hedges.
Here.
Councilmember Lorraine.
Here.
Councilmember Newsom.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Diaz-Nash.
Here.
Mayor Lee.
Here. We're excited to be here in person with options for those who choose not to be in person to participate virtually. There are several ways to participate. For those attending in person, complete a yellow request to speak slip and hand it to our city clerk. If participating remotely, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you will be called upon at the appropriate time. If calling in via phone, press *9 to raise your hand, and when called upon, press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close the public comment period for each specific item. We'll begin with one item on the special meeting agenda, which will be a study session, campaign finance, voluntary expenditure limits, and public financing models. I believe we have a presentation from our Deputy City Clerk, Martin McTaggart.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good evening. Tonight's study session will focus on the topic of campaign finance with a follow-up on Council's direction relating to voluntary expenditure limits and public financing of election campaigns. Kicking off with an overview of tonight's presentation, we will provide a brief background for what has led to this discussion. We will cover some research conducted by staff relating to voluntary expenditure limits, including some staff recommendations for amendments to the city's municipal code, chapter 2.80, contributions and loans to city candidate campaigns. There will be a summary of various models of public financing of election campaigns. And finally, we will look to the City Council to provide some feedback and direction related to these items. To help frame the discussion, staff is requesting council feedback on direction on the following items. Number 1, should staff return with a voluntary expenditure limits ordinance and other proposed ordinance amendments? And if so, 1A, does the council have a preferred limit per resident, $1.50, $2, $2.50, or another amount? 1B, does the council prefer a limit increase in odd-numbered years of 25 cents or an increase by consumer price index? And 1C, does the council wish to exclude certain expenses from the limits, or should all expenses be included? And finally, does the council have any feedback on the public financing research presented? Turning to how we got to tonight's discussion, the city's campaign contribution ordinance was established in 2005, and it established the importance of preserving integrity and openness in the political process. The ordinance was designed to regulate certain campaign contributions as a means to help promote public confidence and protect the integrity of the electoral process. To this end, during its fiscal year 2022-23 goal-setting meeting, Council directed staff to study campaign finance reform policies, including expenditure limits, disclosure requirements for independent expenditures, and improving access to voter education initiatives. And more recently, during the February 21st, 2023 post-election study session on campaign finances, City Council directed staff to conduct research into public financing of election campaigns. To start looking at voluntary expenditure limits, to provide a brief summary of what they are and how they're used by local agencies, what voluntary expenditure limit programs offer is self-imposed spending limits which candidates opt into during the election cycle. Broadly speaking, the end goal for agencies who have adopted voluntary expenditure limits has been to further a more equitable and transparent political landscape. The voluntary expenditure limits approach has been pursued by agencies in part to help curb excessive spending in election campaigns, and it is worth noting that mandatory expenditure limits are constitutionally impermissible. Also of note that during the 2022 election cycle, successful candidate election campaign expenses ranged from $17,000 to $57,000. Taking a look at some local examples of voluntary expenditure limit programs that have been adopted by local agencies. In 2020, the City of Redwood City adopted voluntary expenditure limits with an initial spending cap of $2.25 per resident. This was subsequently increased to $2.36 per resident in 2022, which was a 3.8% increase based on Consumer Price Index. In terms of participation, in 2020, Redwood City saw 7 out of the 9 candidates appearing on the ballot participate in the program, and during the 2022 election cycle, there was a 100% participation rate. In the city of Burlingame, Burlingame adopted voluntary expenditure limits in 2021 with an initial cap on campaign expenses of $30,000. However, in 2024, this rate will be set at $5 per resident in each electoral district. And during the 2022 election, Burlingame had a 100% participation rate in their voluntary expenditure limits program. To briefly illustrate what a voluntary expenditure limit program would look like for candidates seeking elected office, firstly, candidates would be given an opportunity to indicate their intention to participate when they file their candidacy. The voluntary expenditure limits program could be applicable to all expenses incurred by the candidate or the committee in support of the candidacy, or exemptions could be made for specific expenses such as candidate statement fees. Once the candidate filing period closes, the candidates who opt into the program will have a 3 business day period to reconsider their decision. The candidates who opt in will have their participation recognized on the city's website, in the e-newsletter, as well as widely circulated newspapers. For candidates who opt into the program but exceed the limits, this would be publicized through the same avenues. If the council decides to proceed with establishing a voluntary expenditure limits program, there are some options to consider. Firstly, determining what the expenditure limits should be. Listed on this slide are a number of options for the council to consider. If you turn your attention to the table in the lower portion of this slide, an application of the Redwood City $2.36 per resident cap is broken down by district population in San Mateo, and this would roughly average out to approximately $50,000 per district. This slide also lists the Burlingame cap of $5 per resident for their 2024 election. Also listed are some staff proposed options of $1.50 per resident, $2 per resident, and $2.50 per resident. A quick note, staff did consider using voter registration numbers on a per district basis to determine potential spending caps. However, it is important to note the varying percentages of registration by district, which may have led to some concerns relating to inequity. Some options the council may wish to consider is the future ceiling adjustments. Option 1 being to increase in expenditure ceiling amounts in odd-numbered years by 25 cents per resident. Option 2 would be to increase based on Consumer Price Index, considering 2023 to be the base year. Also, as discussed earlier, the council may wish to consider the appropriateness of providing exemption for specific spending. Option 1 would be to follow the Burlingame model and provide no exemptions. Option 2 would be to follow the Redwood City model, which would exempt expenses such as filing fees related to the candidacy, including candidate statement filing fees, legal fees, and costs incurred with litigation, non-monetary contributions as defined by FPPC, and post-election party expenses. Staff is also recommending some amendments to the city's campaign contributions ordinance. Firstly, as it relates to recall elections, in 2022, Assembly Bill 2584 made some changes to the processes for recall elections, whereby the question of whether a local officer should be recalled or not has historically been coupled with the question of who should replace the candidate or the local officer. State law now provides that a recall election would only include the question of whether or not to recall an officer, and the agency would follow its own processes for determining a successor in the event of a successful recall. In short, recall elections are more akin to ballot measure committees, and this proposal is to make conforming changes to state law. Secondly, staff experience with aggregation of contributions has indicated a lack of clarity, in particular as it relates to contributions from an individual and their controlled organization. And the recommendation here is that we clarify to indicate these are subject to the $1,000 limit. As far as next steps, should council provide direction tonight, staff will return with a draft ordinance for adoption to amend Municipal Code Section 2.80. As mentioned, the council can provide some direction on aspects of the draft ordinance. Taking a step back on the topic of transparency in campaign finances, staff would like to highlight the availability of the city's campaign finance dashboard, which serves as the first in our county to provide users with an interactive and accessible tool for exploring various aspects of campaign finance, including contributions by type of contributor, contributions by location, financial summaries, including independent expenditures. Turning our focus to the council request for research into methods of public financing of election campaigns, we looked into various models that have been adopted within the state of California and across the United States. Generally speaking, for agencies who have adopted public financing, the objective has been to reduce the reliance of candidates on private donations and to widen the interest of seeking elected office. As our campaign dashboard shows, the average spend per vote received during San Mateo's 2022 general election was $8.45 for successful candidates. The most common form of public financing is performed using a matching funds model. While there are many variances in the approach, the main key components of a matching fund model are: 1, candidates are required to demonstrate a minimum level of community support. 2, matching funds, typically $6 of public funds for every $1 of private funds raised. The funds received can only be used for specific purposes, and maximum amounts are designated by the type of contest. 3, some form of self-imposed contribution limits, such as number of self-contributions, loans, and contributions received outside of the electoral district. 4, compliance with the program's code of ethics. 5, and finally, each matching funds program requires oversight and enforcement. In larger cities such as San Francisco and LA, oversight is performed by a dedicated ethics commission. This study used participation rates among candidates appearing on the ballot as an indicator of appeal in these programs. On this slide, we see of the candidates who appeared on the ballot in 22, for San Francisco, there were 46% of candidates opting into public finance. For Los Angeles City, there was 65%, and in the city of Berkeley, there was 97%. When looking into the operating costs for these programs, we see that San Francisco distributed over $1 million during the fiscal year 2021-22. In Los Angeles, that figure was almost $13 million for 2022. This study used expenses from San Mateo's 2022 general election to estimate the operating costs for a matching funds model, using a 6-to-1 ratio, meaning for the actual campaign expenses incurred during the election, if we assume a 1/6 portion of private funds required, the amount of public funds required would be approximately $127,000. This study also wishes to note that this figure does not include administrative costs, which would require general fund dollars. Another model of public financing is grant funds, which bears many key similarities to matching funds model, with some key distinctions. The city of Santa Fe, New Mexico operates using a grant funding model, which, as seen on this slide, comes with a requirement for candidates to collect a number of small contributions. Candidates have the ability to accept seed money, which is a limited amount of funding to assist with their objective to participate in the public funding program. In Santa Fe, once eligibility has been confirmed, the city clerk is required to disperse grant funds to candidates seeking office. As shown in this slide, candidates for office of mayor receive $60,000, candidates running for city council receive $15,000, and for any uncontested races, only 10% of these amounts is dispersed. For the most recent election, only 33% of candidates participated in the program. Another model of public financing is the reimbursement funds approach, which until recently was implemented within the city of Oakland. Again, once candidates are considered eligible, certain qualified expenditures were reimbursed by the city, and in their most recent election, total funds dispersed came to $159,000 and 63% of candidates participated. More recently, voters in Oakland passed the Oakland Fair Elections Act measure, which will move the city's public financing model to a voucher program. The voucher program was originally adopted by voters in Seattle as a means to provide both public funding to candidates and to increase engagement in the electoral process. Voters in Seattle receive 4 $25 democracy vouchers, which are then dispersed to candidates of their choosing to fund certain expenses. Seattle Democracy Vouchers program is funded by a voter-approved property tax, which costs the average homeowner approximately $8 per year. The most recent participation rate amongst voters was 7.59%, which was the highest usage rate to date. And studies have shown that participation has increased amongst all racial groups. To help calculate anticipated costs for a San Mateo version of the voucher program, we assumed full usage of the allocated $100 per voter and Seattle's most recent usage rate of 7.59%, and this amount came to approximately $436,000, which, if you include administrative costs, leads to approximately $500,000 from the general fund every 2 years. In conclusion, the agencies who have adopted public financing have done so for several reasons, including limiting contributions from outside the jurisdiction, to increase small contributions, to increase the number of first-time candidates, minimize the number of uncontested races, and to help increase engagement from underrepresented communities. This study has shown that participation rates have varied significantly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction across all models, and agencies have worked to modify their approach in an effort to increase participation. And when speaking directly to staff engaged with overseeing these programs, the recommendation has been to determine key metrics for success. From an operating cost and enforcement perspective, public financing of election campaigns are costly and require significant staff resources for oversight. Briefly, just to highlight for council awareness, there are some related state legislation on this topic. Both Senate Bill 24 and Assembly Bill 270 aim to put the question to the voters in 2024 of whether or not to allow general law cities to adopt public financing models, as currently this is only available to charter cities, as discussed with Los Angeles, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and Long Beach. And as the council are aware, Senate Bill 1439 has strengthened conflict of interest regulations so that contributions of $250 or more would be a conflict for local officials in certain situations requiring disclosure and recusal in certain proceedings. And then here we want to just briefly touch on independent expenditures and looking to define what independent expenditures are. They are not, independent expenditures are by definition not coordinated with affected candidates or committees, and an independent expenditure means a payment in connection with communication expressly advocating for the election or defeat of a candidate or a measure, but not at the behest of the affected candidate or committee. And then on this slide, we just talk a little bit more about the disclosure aspects of independent expenditures. State law requires independent expenditures of $1,000 or more be reported showing candidates and measures supported or opposed. Disclosure of late contributions is also required within 24 hours. There are also semi-annual filing reports with the Secretary of State's office or with the city at the 70% threshold. And reports of late independent expenditures on local candidates and measures are filed with the city. And some cities do require copies of communications funded by independent expenditures to be filed with the clerk. Examples of this are Berkeley and Oakland, with some potential challenges with enforcement. And then just finally, to close out, leaving with some requests for direction and feedback, should staff return with a voluntary expenditure limits ordinance and other proposed ordinance amendments? 1A, does the council have a preferred limit per resident? $1.50, $2, $2.50, or other? Does the council prefer a limit increase in odd-numbered years of 25 cents or increase by consumer price index? And does the council wish to exclude certain expenses from the limits or include all expenses? And finally, number 2, does the council have any feedback on public financing research presented? And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, and I'm actually really happy that highlight to the campaign finance dashboard made it into the presentation. I think our city clerk's office should be really proud of spearheading that initiative, and I know a lot of work went into it from the clerk's office as well as IT. So thank you for that, and this is the time for council questions. Who would like to start? Councilmember Lorraine, please.
Thank you, through the mayor. I was just curious, Martin, in your research related to voluntary expenditure limits adopted by Redwood City and Burlingame, did they have benefits for those who participated beyond what the city of San Mateo might be proposing in the admin report here, namely advertising, joining the program and adhering to this?
Through the mayor, if I can jump in here. So for Redwood City, it's not so much through advertising, but in their model, there is I believe, a 400-word statement that candidates could place on the city's website that goes to the city clerk's office. There's some process involved with that. And in reviewing the various options with Redwood City and Burlingame, we had thought that the amount of process involved with putting that statement up on the website might be disproportional to the actual benefit in putting the statement on the website, since the public may not necessarily be looking at a city website for what an individual who has signed up for this program might be saying. Instead, would the benefit under the proposed ordinance would simply highlight the fact that they're participating in the program, and the candidate is free to say whatever they wish about their participation in their own campaign mailers, on social media websites, which we felt was likely to get more traffic in terms of public review. It's perfectly lawful, what Redwood City is doing. It's just this requires a little less administration.
Thank you. On the subject of public funding options and the potential administrative cost that the city might have to bear to bring one of these options forth, are you aware at this time of significant differences in expenses between the different program options that we're looking at tonight, the matching funds versus the voucher versus the grant?
I think at this point, we would probably need to do a little bit more scoping to kind of determine what the exact administrative costs were for each model. What's included within the staff report is largely an estimate of what the anticipated costs may be. If we receive direction from council that there's a particular model that they're interested in pursuing, we can certainly come back to the council with more details on specific costs. So unfortunately, at this time, I wouldn't be able to provide a fully accurate breakdown of the costs per model in terms of administrative steps.
Okay. Let's see. And just for clarification, if council were interested in moving forward with a public funding option, and I think I saw in the report with regard to voluntary expenditure limits, if council were interested in moving forward with that, staff might be able to implement this program in the next election, 2024. But with public funding options, would that be possible in the next election too, or would we need more time perhaps?
In looking at the public financing model, in order to really do a really good job of a rollout, I think it'd be about a 2-year runway. That's what we see in some of these other cities who are implementing these models. Give staff enough time so that we don't have to dedicate all our staffing resources to this initiative. It just allows us to be able to work through the issues and have a successful rollout. So about 2 years soon. If the council was interested in this, we'd probably look at the 2026 election.
Thank you. No further questions at this time. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, through the mayor. I just had one quick question, following up on Councilmember Lorraine's discussion about promoting this. Was there any discussion about having it be the voluntary contributions limits be part of debates, like when the city or the League of Women Voters or anyone, just as part of the introductory statement? Would that be something that could be considered?
Yes, through the mayor. So in my research for public financing options, actually, I believe it was the city of San Francisco, for participants enrolling or opting in to public financing, one of the requirements for doing so is that they commit to engaging in a public debate with their fellow contestants, or for individuals who also opt into that. So that could be something that potentially could be applied to another program, another such similar program.
Thank you. And if we were just talking about the voluntary expenditure limits, and you said that there would be a statement that would be made about the candidates, I was just wondering whether that statement could be included in the debates, even if we didn't do the public financing. To be considered.
Typically, when you have debates, there's nonprofits or other organizations, so it would be up to them to decide whether or not to have those statements.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's it.
Other questions from council members? Councilmember Hedges.
Thank you. Those were really very good questions. One question I have, I like the idea of voluntary spending limits, but the question I have is that we actually have seen independent expenditure campaigns within the city and also the assembly races. And I was wondering if, without being slapped too much, if somebody was experiencing an independent expenditure campaign against them, if they could rescind that once they've agreed to a spending limit, just for self-preservation.
So as proposed, if I may, to the mayor, a candidate who signed up for voluntary expenditure limits, they would have a 3-day period to decide whether or not to withdraw. That's really based on what the other candidate for that office has decided to do. Doesn't depend on independent expenditures, but what it depends on what that person's opponent would be doing for that race, because it's a little hard to predict how independent expenditures might play out in the course of a campaign.
Well, my question was really, without a lot of negative press over it, if they really felt like they were being attacked, could they back out of that and actually try to get more funds into their campaign?
I mean, I haven't seen a VEL limit sort of framed in that way. It's framed independent of what independent committees are doing. It's really a decision that a candidate would have based on what their opponents are doing.
I think I understand your point in terms of the benefits. Is there a way to roll back benefits that have been given for somebody who has opted into a voluntary expenditure limit program, and then later, after the 3-day window, chooses not to? Is that the line of questioning?
Yeah, because we've seen it here in San Mateo, where we've had people that are hit with independent expenditure campaigns, and obviously they try to raise more money to fight back.
Through the mayor, thank you for clarifying the question. And the penalty really would be just publicizing the fact that that candidate no longer is complying with the voluntary expenditure limit in the same way that the city publicized the fact that they had followed the voluntary expenditure limit through the city's electronic newsletter, on its website, and through one other mechanism as detailed in the draft ordinance.
Okay, that's what I thought. That answers my question. Thank you.
Councilmember Newsom?
Thank you. Through the mayor. Just one question that I noticed was, do you have any reference as to what the consumer price index increase has been over the last 10 years? And the reason why I ask is because when I looked through my expenditures and my race from last year, the biggest expense, bar none, is postage. And what we've been seeing with postage increase is 2.5 to 3.5% postage increase per year. And stamps just keep going up. And so I'm wondering if the consumer price index is going to keep pace with the increase in postage. And direct mail is obviously a pretty influential way to run your race. And so the only concern there would be if the CPI averages at 1.5% increase per year, that's not going to keep pace with the cost expenditures that you're going to have if you do any direct mail at all. So any feedback on that? Thanks.
That's not something that we looked into significantly for this particular study session, but I'd be happy to do a little bit more research on that and get back to the council on that.
So my questions were, do we have, at this point in time, an estimate of, to sort of quantify what the benefit would be to folks that do opt into the voluntary expenditure limit program in terms of like the number of people that are subscribed to our e-newsletter, for example, or a number of hits on a website? Do we have that information handy?
For the mayor, just to clarify the question, so you, in terms of really promoting the benefits of enrolling in the program and kind of what the impact would be for candidates that opt to go with the voluntary expenditure limits, I think what's currently within the proposed ordinance would be, or the working ordinance would be, just further information on the city's website, kind of looking to the Redwood City approach, where they list their candidates on their website, who's running for office, and of those candidates, who has opted in to the program, and making that information available on our website through our e-newsletter and through the daily journal would be the main areas that we'd focus on.
I think, is Samantha on the?
So we have we know the amount of followers that we have, how many hits get on a page, and so we can quantify all those metrics and be able to provide that. That should not be a problem. The number of impressions, all of that. We have all that information.
Okay. And then I guess my other question was, do we have an estimate? So this, I just as a matter of context, I was, spearheading this before we went to district, right? And so we were seeing incredible cost escalation for our at-large elections, and so now that we've converted to district, the costs have reduced by a fifth, maybe fourth, give or take, and so I'll just put that out there in terms of a little bit of the change, the change in situation when you carry an initiative 2 years ago, and now it comes back to us 2 years later. So there's that. I was wondering, one of the questions around the cost, like sort of the fixed cost of the statement of qualifications over time, is it still, when in district, is it still around $2,000?
The candidate statement that goes into the sample ballot, that hasn't been around $2,000. It's been closer around $500 to $700, and it's based on the number of words and how many sample ballots need to be mailed within, and now that it's going to be districts, it should be a little bit less, we think. But yeah, I think it's between $500 and $700.
So 500 is, so I guess my line of questioning is to kind of get our head around what are the kind of fixed costs to just even get in the door before you even are running a campaign?
So definitely they can opt in or opt out to the candidate statement. So that's a personal choice. That is $500 to $700 based on current experience. And then we do have no filing fee in the city of San Mateo, so there's no filing fee. And the spend threshold to form a committee is $2,000. So once you raise or spend $2,000, you do have to form a committee under the Fair Political Practices Commission. So those are kind of the key dollar amounts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then switching gears into sort of another line of questioning, I noticed that there were some cities that have a filing requirement for IEs, and and I just wanted to understand as we currently operate, is there any systematic way for us as a city, who is charged with, voter education, to have any systematic visibility to campaign materials that are being disseminated to the electorate, to voters? Is there any systematic process in place right now for us to understand what voters are receiving, whether it's from candidates directly or independent expenditure committees?
I think our current process is mostly informal. We don't have like a formal record of any campaign literature that's been distributed. Anecdotally, we do have staff that live within the city, and we'll from time to time share what materials they've received, just as a means of tracking activity during the election cycle. But we currently don't have a formal process for tracking mailers from independent expenditures.
And so, I remember, one of the things that we were really struggling with was a lot of competing information about recent ballot measures, and during the Measure Y campaign, the city actually took up charge of developing an FAQ and a dedicated website to help educate the voters about what the potential impact of passing it or not would have been, and how to really understand and sort of navigate the information that they were receiving. But again, the information that was put out there to a large extent was sort of impaired because we didn't have full visibility to what was being shared with the voters. Right, so in the age of information where there's, there are in some cases, campaigns that are peddling disinformation, right? And our job as in city government is to try to help voters make informed and educated decisions, knowing what information people and voters are getting is important to the process of voter education. And so, and I'll just share that in my time I've seen that be a limitation, that it sounds like we don't have a systematic process to address. And that's not to say, everyone has a First Amendment right. There's no debating that. And I don't think that this discussion is any way implying that the city would have any censorship or stake at all in what gets shared, but more so an effort to document what information is actually going out there and being disseminated. So it sounds like we don't have a system in place right now. Okay.
That's
Is there a
correct.
follow-up question? Councilmember Hedges.
Thank you for bringing that up, actually. So I think we might, if we get too far into that, end up with a First Amendment complaint, but if we're careful, we probably wouldn't. The one thing I wasn't sure of in the discussion was if someone's running an independent expenditure campaign within San Mateo, do they have to file with us? Good, okay, so we at least know the basis for that.
Through the mayor, if I can just clarify the question, are you asking about the requirement to file a campaign statement or the requirement to file an election communication?
Both.
So there's no filing requirement for an election communication, such as a mailer. There is a filing requirement for late independent expenditures under state law today. Those have to be filed if it's $1,000 or more within 24 hours, and there's a time period that's defined as what's considered late. It's basically 90 days before the election. So those are filed. They were filed in the last election, and that's still an ongoing requirement, but not so for actual independent expenditure-funded election communications.
But there is no limit to what somebody can contribute in an independent campaign, right?
Correct. Independent committees are unregulated. They are not subject to contribution limits. No one is subject to expenditure limits, including independent committees.
And are there names that are recorded of those independent expenditures?
Yeah, so under state law, independent committees are subject to disclosure requirements. There are semi-annual statements that have to be filed. And also, as I said, late independent expenditure reports that are filed at the city. And also, as a matter of clarification, on one slide, there was a reference to a 70% threshold. What that meant was if you have a committee that's multi-purpose, it spends money on state issues, city issues, county issues, if you hit a threshold of 70% where you're spending that much or more on exclusively city measures or city candidates, that's when your filing requirement is triggered to file locally. If it's a mixture, the default is with the Secretary of State. I know that's a lot of information, but the bottom line is independent committees are subject to filing requirements today, and their contributors also have to be listed in their semi-annual statements.
Okay, thank you.
And also as a follow-up, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, City Clerk and Deputy Clerk, that there's at least an intention and hope that the dashboard, the campaign finance dashboard will evolve. And at this point, we're aggregating independent expenditures, but potentially down the road, there's an opportunity to at least create maybe a matrix or a list of the committee names. And committee names can be, I love puppies, right? They don't necessarily point to direct donor sources. However, if you provided a list of the committee names and their FPPC number, at least it's easier to search through the database to understand where the source money is actually coming from. And so that potentially is another area where our campaign finance dashboard can move into to make that more readily accessible for the layperson to find the primary donor sources that are associated with IEs.
Sure, I can speak to that briefly. So when we were designing the dashboard for the 2022 election, what we wanted to make sure was that for individuals who are interacting with this for the first time, there wasn't kind of an overwhelming amount of information being presented initially. The dashboard was intended to kind of give people the opportunity to kind of dig deeper if they're interested in finding out, well, who provided contributions or what the expenses were for. And we do link to the Secretary of State's website within the dashboard, but absolutely we'd be open to looking at any further enhancements to the dashboard should council direct us to do so.
Any other questions? Please.
I know it's not here, but do you have any statistics to kind of bear out the theory that because we're now on district elections, we're spending less per vote? I mean, obviously, we have a smaller voter pool, so the amount we have to raise is less, and spending is theoretically less. But do we have anything we can look at from past elections as to what, for example, in 2020 or 2018, the overall vote or cost per vote was? Because I theorize that might not actually bear out. Like it may have been because you had 100,000 people potentially voting, you were only spending $1 per vote as opposed to $11 per vote. Do we have anything like that, or do you have any insight with that?
We definitely do. Councilmember Newsom, we have data going back to at least the last 12 years of elections that we could pull up.
Interesting just to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. That is a good question and interesting to follow. As a point of reference, I think it's interesting. Okay, so this is the time where we open it up for public comment. Do we have any public comment?
No, Madam Mayor, we have no public comment.
Okay, then we'll close public comment. And does it make sense to bring up the slide with the questions? Okay, who would like to start? Should we just go one at a time, or one question and then see where everyone is, so we can deal with this one section at a time? I'll start with one that's not here. Does everyone agree that it would be beneficial for the sake of supporting the integrity of our democracy and education and really fulfilling the role of of the organization to help support voter education, to have more visibility to campaign materials that are being disseminated by creating some kind of filing system for IEs and campaign materials? I would say that if anyone is going to distribute 200 or 250 more pamphlets, mailers, what have you, that they would be required to submit it to the city. I agree that enforcement might be challenging, but I think starting with something is better than having nothing.
If I can add a little bit of context to that portion of the slide. So first, legally, I think these are public mailers, so there's no really valid argument that there's somehow an infringement upon somebody's First Amendment rights of free speech or association. It's a public document. It's mailed to people. It would be a little unusual, but not unheard of. There are other cities that have done this before. Not aware of any other jurisdiction in San Mateo County that has done this, but some other cities have. We would have to understand some of their experience and see how it would work most effectively in San Mateo. On the enforcement challenge, especially when it comes to independent committees, it would be a challenge to, track down those committees and then have them file those documents. We wouldn't necessarily receive those mailers. So especially since the campaign ordinance, it's complaint-driven sort of enforcement mechanism, this would fall in line with that. And just trying to get all of the campaign committees and independent committees to actually comply. I think that's where we would have to look at what other jurisdictions are doing to see, what's successful and what's not. Because when a mailer is actually, if a mailer is actually filed with the city, just depending on how that is made public available, if it's just at the city clerk counter or through some other mechanism. Something to consider is just how effective it would be. It's not a legal issue, it's just more of a practical question. Would the public be looking in that area, or would a particular mailer just come up on social media and be distributed saying, hey, I got this mailer, have you seen this? That's more likely to happen. It's more of a sort of practical, what is the benefit of such a requirement, as opposed to a strictly legal question. It's just something for the council to consider as you debate this.
So I think, I think if I'm hearing, are you asking us what the benefit is, or are you asking us to give direction about whether this is something that the council is interested in learning more about and doing some more exploration on?
It's the latter.
Okay, great. That's what I was hoping for. Okay. Councilmember Hedges?
I'm intrigued by it. I think there's some things we have to look at. I don't think we can put a time limit on when it has to be turned in. We might say it would be preferable to come to the city at the time that it's sent to the mailing house, because sometimes in response to various issues, you might want to turn something around very quickly. And so I'm assuming that we're not going to have any pre-authorizations on this because it could get into First Amendment issues there. So as long as we have a reasonable time for it to be sent to the city, and as long as we're not passing judgment on anything, then I think it's probably a pretty good idea. But again, it's going to be on a voluntary basis. I don't think you can force people to do it.
Councilmember Newsom?
Yeah. I just wanted to clarify something that you were talking about. So if the idea is that anytime anyone mails out more than 250 pieces to endorse a candidate or endorse a measure, that they'd have to declare that, the one worry I have would be particularly the neighborhood associations, because neighborhood associations do a lot of communication without direct mail. For example, in my district, there's neighborhood associations that commonly will pass out 1,000 flyers in the neighborhood. And if the neighborhood association says, we're not backing this measure, do they have to declare that then? I mean, or are we only talking about if it's direct mail of over more than 250 pieces?
I guess I was thinking that, if a entity is doing any sort of campaign activity, which means that they're supporting a candidate or a ballot measure or not, right? That and they're disseminating it widely, whether it's by mail or walk pieces. That that it's helpful for the city to have a repository of that material and information that's being disseminated to community. And so there's nothing to stop a neighborhood association from disseminating it. The idea would be as a courtesy or as a practice, as an expectation, my hope, that they would then, email a copy to the city clerk, so that the city clerk has a record of the information that has gone out regarding any kind of ballot or candidate information or position. So I don't think that it's onerous, in terms of the reporting, process. I think tracking down all of the potential players. There's ACLU and other, sort of national IEs that come through that might not be as tuned into our local city, but I think that, to the extent that, that it is, that we have capacity, that we can set expectation, that we can and establish a process from, nothing to something, so that we're more in tune with what community is receiving. They're receiving voter education. And in some cases, especially in the cases where the city is actually, where the council is putting forward things on the ballot measure, we need to know what is out there so that we can help better educate the community and play a role, right? I think we have a role to play in better drawing the lines between fact and fiction.
If I may interject again to speak to Councilmember Newsom's question, some ordinances, I think Berkeley springs to mind, will have an exception for member communications so that if an organization is purely communicating as part of a regular newsletter to their own members, I have seen that as a carve out to the requirement to file a mailer.
Okay, so that's up for consideration. So I think the question right now that we're.
Just want to say, like, it's not that I disagree with it in principle. I'm worried that it's going to be very difficult to try to enforce it all. I mean, I have 5 neighborhood associations, and they all put out at least 1 or 2 newsletters a year. Some put out 5 or 6 newsletters a year, and generally they're weighing in on opinions of things that are going on in their neighborhood and their community. And so that whether that be backing a measure or just saying, like, we think we need to get behind this flood measure. We think we need to stop this flood measure. And so I just kind of am a little concerned that we're just not going to be able to enforce it. There's no way to have a lot of regulatory, authority over it is what I'm trying to say.
I think the scoping would be, is it about an election, though? Right?
Sure.
So not like, do we want this pothole fixed? Which we do. We want all the potholes to be fixed. Okay, so right now what we're talking about is this interesting? Are we interested enough to ask staff to further explore this? Deputy Mayor.
Through the mayor, thank you very much. Well, I think the goal is great. I would strongly recommend against doing this because we're only talking about mailers. A lot of what happens is through social media. And I don't see, number one, I don't see how you can possibly submit if you put up an ad or a pop-up or this or that or who's doing it. I think it's also very difficult to try and understand who is the social media or who is the mailer or who is the flyer targeted at. And I think that has a big impact on what the impact of the marketing communication is. I also think it could be incredibly time-sucking and difficult for staff to try and wrangle the cat of what is this and who's doing it. And to your point, if the ACLU came in from the state of Minnesota and did something, how could they possibly know? Or if someone from somewhere outside of the district, why should they want to follow it? So do we wind up getting a very incomplete picture? And is staff really spending a lot of time on things that are not achieving the goal that I think you're talking about, which is a good goal, but I don't see how realistically it could be done without a lot of time, expense, and a comprehensive view. So I would not be supportive of doing this.
Through the mayor, I would say I find the concept interesting as well. I without getting into the weeds, I think I would support asking staff to look into what other cities and jurisdictions have done and maybe get some initial study and look into what this might look like, what it could look like for the city of San Mateo. I feel like I share some of the concerns of the deputy mayor, and we've already had a little discussion about what this could entail and how effective it could be. But I feel like I'm okay with considering what we can do through a bit more study and research and then make that judgment at that time.
So it sounds like we have enough to at least consider further analysis. Councilmember Hedges.
Yeah, and listening to everybody else, I do have some concern about how much staff time it's going to take and how much stress it's going to be on staff. So, in knowing more about it, I would really like to know the amount of staff time it's going to take to do this before I would say yes.
I agree, and I think that we absolutely need to consider capacity of staff. I think that looking at some of the models out there and then getting city clerk's input on what the administrative lift would be very important to our assessment. Okay, are we ready to move on? Okay, number 1, should staff return with the VEL ordinance and other proposed ordinance amendments? A, does the council have a preferred limit per resident? Who wants to go first? Go ahead.
The answer to number 1, yes. I have I want to set the limit high enough that people actually want to do it. So I'm saying $2.50 or $3. Probably prefer $3. It doesn't do any good to have it if opting in means that you're not going to be able to run a good campaign. Does the council prefer a limit increase in odd number of years? Probably, but consumer price index rounded off to the nearest number. Does the council wish to exclude certain expenses? I made a note of those that I would like to exclude. Let me look. Filing fees, legal fees, and any litigation that you have to engage in. That's certainly not things that are going to help the campaign. And number two, does council have any feedback on
Maybe we'll stop there and we'll address one first.
whatever you'd like to do? You're the boss.
Thank you. All right, I think just to kind of stay on the same page with number one, which is pretty meaty in itself, does anyone else want to weigh in on their position so far? So number one, who wants to go? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, through the mayor. In terms of number one, I agree that it would be good to return with a voluntary expenditure limits ordinance. I think it's very important for all the reasons that Deputy Clerk talked about. I would prefer a $2.50. I think the $5 that Burlingame approved, I think that's a very rich number, and I think $2.50 would give anyone within a district a fair amount to do something. I think number B, in terms of just making it simple and communicable, I would prefer a limit increase in odd numbered years of 25 cents. So it goes from $2.50 to $2.75 to $3, rather than $2.50 to $2.72 to $2.84. I just think that is difficult for the public to understand. And does the council wish to exclude certain expenses? I would agree with sort of the baseline, the filing fees, litigation, but I would look to staff to come back with a recommendation as to what really is the core of that type of thing, so that we don't exclude so much that it becomes a worthless expenditure limit. Thank you.
Thank you, through the mayor. I think my answer to number one is yes, or sure. For letter A, I found myself thinking that maybe $2 might be more interesting to me, something in the middle. I noticed that $1.50, as laid out in the staff report, per resident, would have covered virtually all of the candidates from the 2022 district elections who ran without fundraising limits already. And so while I think we don't necessarily have to use that as an ultimate cap, I'm not sure if we need it to be much higher than the $2 level. It doesn't seem to me to be a huge issue. If a majority of council were interested in a higher amount, I could get behind it, but I do think it loses efficacy. There are diminishing returns maybe if it's too high, as the deputy mayor kind of alluded to. For letter B, I found this kind of interesting because to me, I think I feel like we're dealing with a couple of variables between elections here. We have the potential increase in cost of materials, which Councilmember Newsom sort of brought up, and expenses. And I think CPI might do a fairly good job of accounting for that. But we also may have assuming we go ahead with our general plan update process, we're kind of expecting an increase in population. And so it may be fair to expect that, even election to election, at least when we think about in 4 years' time, for a district election, that the number of residents and voters may have increased since the last time. So we may want to try and account for that as well. So to me, I'm sort of thinking CPI plus, which, I feel like maybe is in line with what Councilmember Newsom was hinting at. And so to me but on the other hand, I think a quarter sounds like a lot. after every 2 years, because even if we are interested in the $250 amount to start, that would be 10% more after each election. And again, with the district elections, that would be 2 times that before the next district election, which sounds like a lot to me. Yeah, if we were to start at 150 or 2, it would be even more percent than that, right, from that baseline. So I was actually thinking that maybe something like 12.5 cents every 2 years might make more sense. It might be a little like it's about 5% from 250, and it kind of that's where my head is at, for what it's worth. Does the council wish to exclude certain expenses? I think it would be fine to exclude the expenses that were recommended or at least shown as examples in the staff report. But interestingly, I think that it might, like, my answer might depend a little bit on whether council is also interested in pairing this with public funding. And I think I do feel, I'll just take this opportunity to mention that I think that while the voluntary expenditure limit is in general, I think, something we may wish to pursue, whether we go with public funding or not, its efficacy is going to be greatly increased, and it's going to matter a lot more if we were to pair it with public funding. And so I just had a thought that if we don't pair it with public funding, then I think it may be best to exclude certain example expenses from the limits. But if we were to pair it with public funding, then we might not want to exclude expenses, because that might give people running the opportunity to get more of a benefit out of their fundraising and the public funding process, and put it toward the totality of their expenses. Thank you.
Councilmember Newsom.
To question 1, yes. Amount preferred limit per resident, $2.50 to start. For B, I'm kind of on the fence, but I hear what Adam's saying about 25 cents might be higher than needs be, but I also liked what Deputy Mayor Nash said about having a round number each. So, I don't like 12.5%. I'd rather be 10 or 15 or something but I don't think that's even that relevant. So yes, we can come up with what that is. And then as far as C, does the council wish to include, obviously, I believe filing in legal expenses, and then we would look to staff to tell us what would be normal and expected for others. Thanks.
Councilmember Lane.
I'm sorry, I remembered something else that I thought might be useful when we are just sort of thinking about these limits, which was, part of the reason why I was thinking about the idea that we're increasing population is because we are, at least it seems, going by the census, and the census is done every 10 years. So I think I would recommend that sort of whatever numbers we adopt, to maybe look at the overall layout after every census comes out and consider whether we might want to right-size it. If, for example, projected increases don't go as projected, and/or like if we increase it by a quarter and then we find ourselves kind of in the Burlingame range after 10 years, and maybe that doesn't feel like, commensurate with the expenses that people are raising or something. So I would just recommend a review after each census, or like give staff the opportunity after the census numbers come out to kind of look and determine whether we want to maybe change the current dollar amount per resident we're at to better reflect our targets and our goals.
If I can.
Councilmember Hedges.
As to the question A, 1A, I said $2.50 to $3, but listening to all the council folks, I'm going to change it to a flat $2.50.
If I can interject through the mayor, just as to the point that Councilmember Lorraine mentioned about reviewing the ordinance or these numbers, after the census. The ordinance already calls for reviewing it after every election, so I think that would probably cover your concern.
Thank you.
Okay, my turn. Number one, yes. I think we all knew that answer. And I was, for the same rationale as Councilmember Lorraine, I was strongly leaning towards the lowest level, so $1.50 or $2 seems quite appropriate to me with a built-in increase that, to be defined. So it sounds like the majority of council is at $2.50, and that's, so we'll move on to B. I think that I'm comfortable with either CPI or, I also don't like the 0.5% or I think we should be working in whole numbers. So I would be open to a, 15-cent increase or something like that. Or CPI, I don't have a hard line. I do, I do have some hesitations, I'll say, just for the sake of, getting it out there, that with our planned growth, and the census only being done, once a decade, there may be situations where new developments pop up. Like, for example, Deputy Mayor and I today were at a new development that's going to bring 225 new families to the city of San Mateo in one district, right? And we, very well might see significant and concentrated population growth that won't be accounted for with census data that goes stale over time. And so there's a part of me that wonders, is there a way to kind of split the baby so that if we were to, sort of look at increases in registered voters as sort of an indicator of how we peg an increase to CPI or another defined increase to in odd years, that might be a way that we more closely track population growth more accurately over time. So I know that that's not part of the existing models out there, but maybe that's because they haven't thought of this really great idea. So, I think that, we know that we are planning for growth. We also know that census data is a point in time, and that I don't want to create a policy that over time significantly disadvantages certain certain candidates that become impaired by voluntary expenditure limits, that with the whole intent of this program and campaign finance reforms are really to help open the door, level the playing field. And so if we're looking at potential changes in population and demographics that would significantly increase or potentially, who knows, decrease in a very unlikely situation, the population, and then construct our entire program around an assumption that we know isn't going to hold, then that I find problematic. So maybe there's a way for us to think about some kind of blended metric that we base increases on an increase in voter population and then consumer price index increase, or set increase in the contribution limits. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. Something else for the council to consider is that the U.S. Census Bureau does come out with population estimates. They're different from the actual census count that's constitutionally mandated, but they do come out with estimates on a periodic basis, which, we can provide some more information on that regard, which may help alleviate some concerns about the potentially stale nature of a number fixed in time when possibly that number could evolve based on the information provided based from the census.
Yes, if we can reliably count on like the community survey, which I think is every 5 years, then that would be great. And build our increases around incorporating and considering that. Okay, C. I liked what I think Councilmember Hedges was saying, and essentially mimicking the Redwood City model. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so are we good with number 1? Have we covered that?
I think I just wanted to clarify everyone's position on 1B. Councilmember Hedges, I have CPI. Councilmember Diaz-Nash, I have 25 cents. Councilmember Lorraine, I have 12.5 cents. And Mayor Lee, I have either 15 cents or CPI. Was that where we landed? And then Councilmember Newsom, would you mind just clarifying?
25 cents for
Through the mayor,
CPI.
clarify.
Councilmember Hedges?
What I did say was there was more to it than just the CPI, rounding either up or down to the after 0.5 to the closest number, so that it doesn't get crazy.
So, and just as a reminder, the electorate doesn't have to manage this number. It's only the candidate. It's one person. So I don't think it'll be that crazy. As long as you can do some basic budgeting, which I hope is true if you're going to take up this work. So do you have what you need on 1? Great. Okay, let's move on to number 2. I think Councilmember Hedges.
Yes, thank you. I think that public financing at some time in the future will be a good idea. Right now, I'm not for it because we've got tremendous amount of infrastructure. We also got a dearth in the amount of staff that we really need to run this organization. There's a great number of vacancies, and we have to look toward filling those and at least finding money to keep people from flooding. So I really think that the time for public financing is now, but it may be in the future. Thank you.
Anyone else? Councilmember Lorraine.
Thank you, through the mayor. So I appreciate this work. I'm excited at the opportunity for the city to not only follow a couple other cities in the county that have adopted voluntary expenditure limits, but maybe even take a lead in pairing it with a public funding option. I think I really do feel like the value of voluntary expenditure limits would be heightened quite a bit if we could do both. I like the idea of democracy dollars, the voucher system, and would like to hear other council members' thoughts on it. But I do think it might be a bit early to want to jump in if we only have, one city that has been implementing it so far. I did read an article that seemed to suggest that the city of Oakland, even though it passed Measure W, is not going to be able to implement it in the 2024 election due to budget concerns. I see that Seattle has established a funding source, and we haven't yet. And its highest success rate to date is a little low seeming. So given this and our own city's budget concerns, I could see shelving this for now. But I would, if a majority of council were interested in it, I could get on board. I like the idea of matching funds, and I'm higher on it than the other systems, and would be excited to see the city pursue this as a strong complement to the expenditure limits. I think the staff helpfully provided a number of reasons why other cities and jurisdictions have pursued, I think, both voluntary expenditure limits and public funding. And a lot of them, I think, resonate with the spirit behind, I think, what brought this to a council priority in the first place. Limiting campaign contributions as a proportion of total contributions from outside the jurisdiction. Clearly, if we were to adopt something like matching funds in the way that is presented in this example as something like a 6-to-1 ratio, then the vast, assuming we had good participation, the vast majority of funds would be coming locally. This increasing the number of small contributions provided to candidates is a possibility here based on the rules that we might set with this program, right? So if we're asking candidates to obtain a certain number of small contributions in order to qualify for the program, then this program might thereby increase the number of small contributions. I believe it would have an opportunity to increase the number of first-time candidates and make it simpler for those to do so. I remember Councilmember Newsom mentioning, that this is a real cost, even if it has been reduced by district elections, and this would certainly make it more. It would make it, the line, the floor for engaging in the way that candidates did with no restrictions would become much smaller as a result of a program like this. So I find that appealing. I think it has the potential to minimize the number of uncontested elections, although we haven't necessarily had that problem before. And in the interest of time, I think that's probably good enough for now.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you, through the mayor. I think we all share a goal of trying to increase transparency, minimize expense in all of our elections. And while I think that the spirit of public financing follows that, I think the actual implementation, I support Councilmember Hedges' position that this is not something that we should take up right now, because we are faced with so many. We have the general plan, we have the housing element, we have the stormwater initiative, we have all the things we want to do to make our city grow effectively, and we also have a staff shortage and difficulty to hire staff. So I think this would be just such an incredibly difficult challenge for staff to implement, and I would rather have their resources focused on making our general plan a real success. So at this time, I would not be in favor of public financing.
For the reasons stated by Councilman Hedges and Deputy Mayor Diaz-Nash, I also think that while I'm interested in pursuing this, I think we need to shelf this maybe for 2 years and circle back to it. I'd also like, if we're going to pursue this in 2 years, to potentially start looking to see what we can carve out in the budget for it. I just think when we look at the budget right now, we're already dipping into rainy day funds. We have so many things coming at us that I don't think it's feasible right now to pursue it. But that doesn't mean I don't ever want to. I'd like to see it shelved or tabled for a period of time and brought back to study. Thanks.
Well, I think, I appreciate the consideration for our city staff and all the many competing needs and budget items that we have. I also, I think that it's really important for us who hold positions of power to take up the responsibility of opening the door and opening the channels to other people. So, we have a responsibility, in my view, to make it easier for the next generation of leadership. And that's really the intent. We hold the seats right now. Who are we bringing up in the next generation? How is that next generation more reflective of our community, more representative of our community? What is our role and responsibility in lowering barriers to entry? That's the work of policymaking. That is what we are charged to do. And so, I think that, it's important, it's important to do everything. It is. We actually do have responsibility to look at how we, how we implement policies that make our democracy healthier, right? And so what we can do today, I took this up back in 2022, right? And now it's 2023 coming back to us, and we wouldn't, even if we decided we want to pursue this, it wouldn't be implemented in 2 years' time, right? So, I think that we can do this work with a high sensitivity to bandwidth and capacity. And so I would like to, propose for council's consideration and what I believe would be sort of an intermediate approach. I think the wholesale, kind of models out there, they're early, as were stated, they're expensive, they can be kind of, they haven't been proven out. But maybe there are other things that we can do to lower entries to barrier, to make it more equitable, and to open the doors to a healthier and more representative government. And so what I think, going back to the conversation that we are having about, what are the fixed costs to candidates? The big fixed cost to candidates is for those who opt into getting a candidate statement into the voter information pamphlet, which is about $500 to $700 per candidate. One way to level the playing field so that that one cost is not a barrier, right, is to say, maybe we do a reimbursement program, a pilot reimbursement program for that sole cost for, those who meet the eligibility requirement. That's something that, we could look at how it could be implemented. We could look at a timeline for implementation 2 years from now. But saying that we're not going to do anything, that we're not going to make any decisions now, that we'll take this up for consideration 2 years from now, instead of thinking about how we can move an idea forward for implementation in 2 or 3 years, really you're talking about kicking down a timeline, 5 years from now. And is that your legacy? Is that the legacy of the decisions that we make today in terms of our role of preserving the health of this democracy, in terms of what we can do to help lower barriers of entry to make it more representative? I believe that there are ways that we can implement this on a small scale that are within capacity, that have minimal financial impact, but for a low-wage worker who's looking at $700 to even consider doing this, right? That could make or break a difference. That could make or break a decision. And then sadly, we don't have that many low-wage, low-income candidates, right? You would accept that? We got a 1, we got a 2, we got a 3.
What I would like to propose is $500, a flat fee for people that are going to join us as a candidate. That way the cost is not horrific.
Okay.
We have 10 candidates, it's not all that much.
I think that's a good place to start. I see nodding heads. Councilmember Newsom?
Yeah, while conceptually I think that there's some attractiveness to that, I think if we're going to look at public financing, we need to look at public financing rather than just say, here's $500. So I guess it's a bit piecemeal for me. So I would not support just doing that.
So it sounds like we have Councilmember Hedges, myself. Is there a third person who is interested in this idea?
Yes, I am very interested. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay,
So 500.
500.
500 limit?
I think 500 as a reimbursement cost for, towards the candidate statement. Can we say that?
Can I, through the mayor, if I could, can we not settle on an amount tonight? Can we bring back some data for you to look at? Because they do an estimate for each election, and, what if it's 1,000? So maybe it would be better if we I know some cities don't charge for candidate statements, and we could just do that and not have it be reimbursement. So let us investigate it and bring that idea back.
I like it even better. Thank you, City Clerk.
That's why we can't do it without Patrice.
Okay, do you have what you need from us,
I
Martin?
do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, that was a really healthy conversation, and we finished on time. It's almost 7 o'clock. We will we will adjourn and return in about 5 minutes, so see you at 7:05. Thank you.